The air in the great hall didn't just feel quiet. It felt heavy. It was a thick, tangible thing, woven from years of ambition, failure, and the ghost of every note ever played within these walls. Sunlight, thick with golden dust, fell from high-arched windows, illuminating rows of empty red velvet seats that seemed to lean in, listening for a sound that wasn't there. Every surface gleamed with a deep, polished luster, the dark wood of the stage, the black lacquer of the grand piano waiting like a sleeping beast, the brass railings that shone like frozen fire. This was a place of reverence, a temple built to worship the gods of music, and today, the high priest was holding court at the center of it all. Seated in a simple chair that looked more like a throne was the man they called the maestro. He was an older man, with a face that seemed carved from granite and a mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, but it was his posture that commanded the room. He sat with a rigid spine, his hands resting on his knees, fingers long and still, like a spider waiting. His name was Viktor Petrov, and to the young musicians gathered before him, he was more than a teacher. He was a final judgment. Stories about him were whispered in the practice rooms late at night, tales delivered with a mixture of terror and awe. They said he could hear a single misplaced note from 100 feet away. They said he could tell if your heart wasn't in the music, that he could smell insincerity like a bad perfume. A student from a few years back had apparently packed his bags and left the conservatory forever after Petrov had listened to him play for 30 seconds. Then simply said, "You are a technician. Go fix clocks." The air around him crackled with a dangerous energy, a promise of brilliant insight or brutal dismissal. He scanned the line of students, his gaze a physical force, making them shift their weight and swallow hard. Among them stood a young woman who felt the weight of that gaze more than anyone else. Her name was Alara, and she felt like a single, out-of-place weed in a perfectly manicured garden. While the others stood with the easy confidence of those who had grown up with music in their homes. With private tutors and expensive instruments, Ilara's journey had been different. Her story began in a small apartment that always smelled of old books and her grandmother's cooking, with a rickety upright piano that missed more notes than it hit. Her hands, though nimble, weren't the soft, pampered hands of her peers. She felt the difference now, as she clenched them into fists inside the pockets of her simple dress. It was a nice dress, the best she owned, but it didn't shimmer like the silk worn by the girl standing next to her. Alara was here on a scholarship, a testament to raw talent that had somehow caught the eye of the admissions board. But standing here now, under the searing light of the maestro's attention, she felt like an imposter. She felt like the amateur he was so famous at sniffing out. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with fear. The maestro lifted a single, elegant finger, pointing it at a young man with a face full of hopeful earnestness. The boy walked to the piano, his back straight, trying to project a confidence he clearly didn't feel. He placed his sheet music on the stand, a piece by Bach, a composer known for mathematical precision and divine structure. The boy took a breath, let his fingers hover over the keys for a moment, and then began to play. It was good. It was technically very good. The notes were clear, the tempo was steady, the phrasing was correct. It was a perfect photograph of a Bach fugue. For a full minute, the only sound in the hall was the precise, clean music tumbling from the piano. Then, another sound cut through it. The maestro cleared his throat, a small, dry sound, but it might as well have been a gunshot. The boy's fingers faltered, a jarring note echoing his surprise. "Stop," Petrov said, his voice not loud but carrying an impossible weight. The boy froze, his hands hovering over the keys. "You have played the notes," the maestro continued, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. "You have pressed the correct keys in the correct order. Congratulations. You have successfully proven you can read. But where is the God in it?" Bach was writing a conversation with the divine. "You are reading a grocery list. It is empty. It is a hollow shell. Sit down." The boy's face, which had been hopeful, was now a mask of crushed humiliation. He mumbled an apology, gathered his music, and practically fled back to his place in line. The silence that followed was even heavier than before, thick with the boy's shame and the collective fear of everyone else. One by one they went. A young woman played a Chopin nocturne with a delicate touch, pouring what seemed like all her emotion into it. When she finished, there was a single, beautiful tear rolling down her cheek. The maestro waited for it to fall before speaking. "Sentimental drivel," he said, causing the girl to flinch as if struck. "You are not feeling the music. You are acting. You are a bad actress playing the part of a sad musician." Next, another student, a burly young man with hands like shovels, launched into a thunderous Liszt etude, a piece designed for showing off explosive power. He played with a ferocity that made the piano seem to shake. When he finished breathing heavily, the maestro stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. "Noise," he finally said. "That is all. Just noise. A great deal of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You are a child banging on pots and pans. Go." Each dismissal was a small, precise wound, delivered with surgical calm. He wasn't angry. He was worse than angry. He was disappointed, as if each of them had personally failed to live up to the sacred art form they claimed to love. And then his finger pointed at her. Ilara felt a jolt, as if an electric current had passed through the floor and up her spine. It was her turn. Every eye in the room was on her as she walked the long, lonely path to the piano. The polished wood of the stage felt slick under her shoes. The piano loomed, its black surface reflecting her own pale, anxious face. She had no sheet music. The piece she had chosen, a Rachmaninoff concerto, was one she knew by heart, a piece she had poured 1,000 hours of her life into. It was a piece of towering passion and breathtaking technical difficulty, and she had hoped, prayed, that its raw power would be enough to make him see her, to make him see past the simple dress and the scholarship and hear the music that lived inside her. She sat on the bench, its worn leather cool against her legs. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys, took a deep, shaky breath, and began. The opening chords were meant to be bold, full of a dark Russian soul. She poured everything she had into them, all her hope, all her hunger, all the memories of playing on that old, out-of-tune piano for her family, dreaming of a stage just like this one. The music swelled, filling the vast hall with its complex emotional tapestry. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the feeling of the music wash over her, trying to connect with the heart of the composer and with her own. She was barely a dozen bars in, just beginning to navigate the intricate, passionate melody, when a single hand rose from the throne-like chair. It was a simple gesture, just a raised palm, but it cut through her music like a knife. Her fingers stopped instantly, the sound dying in mid-air, leaving a sudden, gaping hole in the world. The silence that rushed back in was absolute, and it was terrifying. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He hadn't moved from his chair, but his expression had changed from bored indifference to something far worse, a look of profound, almost clinical disappointment. "Stop," he commanded, his voice quiet but sharp enough to slice glass. He held her gaze, his eyes like chips of ice. "Technique is passable. Barely. You have the fingers. I will grant you that. But this," he said, gesturing vaguely at the piano, as if at something disgusting, "this is not music. This is sentimentality. It is the sound of a child having a tantrum and calling it art. You are trying so hard to feel, to force an emotion onto the notes that you have created nothing but a noisy mess. You have the notes, but you have no music. You have no understanding, no soul. You are an amateur," as the word hung in the air between them, ugly and final. Amateur, a collective sympathetic gasp rippled through the other students. It was the most brutal dismissal yet. Humiliation burned hot on Ilara's cheeks, a fire that threatened to consume her whole. She felt frozen, trapped under the weight of his judgment, her hands still resting on the keys that had just betrayed her. The entire world seemed to shrink to the space between her and the maestro, space filled with the echoing sound of that one terrible word. For a long moment, the world ceased to exist. There was only the silence, thick and suffocating, and the single, ugly word that hung in the air between her and the man on the throne. Amateur. It echoed in the vast, empty spaces of the concert hall, bouncing off the gilded ceilings and the polished floors, seeming to grow louder with each repetition. Alara's fingers, which had been dancing with passion just seconds before, were now frozen on the keys, stiff and foreign. They felt like they belonged to someone else. She could feel the eyes of every other student on her, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. She could feel the weight of the maestro's gaze, a cold, heavy pressure that pinned her to the piano bench. The heat of shame that had started on her cheeks now spread down her neck and across her chest, a fire that made her want to shrivel up and disappear into the cracks of the polished wood stage. Her mind was a blank wall of white noise. The Rachmaninoff she had practiced for thousands of hours, the notes she thought she knew so well, had evaporated. All she could hear was that one word rolling over and over in her head. Amateur. It was the worst thing he could have said. It was the one label she had fought her entire life to escape. It wasn't just a critique of her playing. It was a judgment on her very being, on her past, on her family, on the rickety old piano in her small apartment that smelled of dust and her mother's cooking, the whispers she had overheard in the hallways of the conservatory, the subtle digs about her common background, her lack of a famous tutor or a priceless instrument hit, all culminated in this single, devastating public verdict from the one man whose opinion was supposed to matter most. He hadn't just critiqued her performance. He had confirmed her deepest, most secret fear that she didn't belong here, that she was a fraud who had just been found out. A powerful, primal urge took hold of her. Run. Just get up and walk away. Or don't even walk. Just run. Flee from this hall, from this suffocating silence, from the pitying stares and the crushing weight of his judgment. She imagined herself standing up, the legs of the bench scraping loudly against the stage. She imagined not even looking at him, just keeping her eyes fixed on the distant double doors at the back of the hall. She could feel the muscles in her legs tensing, ready to push her body into motion. She could almost taste the sweet, cool air of the outside world, a world where no one knew what a Rachmaninoff concerto was supposed to sound like, a world where she could just be Alara again. She could pack her bags tonight, be on the first bus home tomorrow, and never touch a piano again. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting, like a warm blanket in a freezing room. It was the easiest way out. It's the only way to escape the humiliation that was burning a hole right through her. But as she made to move, as she began to lift her hands from the keys, a different feeling rose up from the pit of her stomach. It wasn't courage, not yet. It was something smaller, harder, like a tiny stone in her shoe. It was a flicker of defiance. This man, this icon sitting in his throne, had dismissed her soul. He had heard her attempt to replicate another man's passion, 100-year-old passion written by a Russian genius, and he had found it wanting. He had heard a copy. He had heard an imitation. And in a way he was right. She had been so desperate to prove she could play the great music, to fit into their world, that she had forgotten the most important thing. He hadn't heard her. He hadn't heard the music that lived inside her. The music that had no name and came from a place so much deeper than a sheet of paper. The image of her grandfather's face flashed in her mind, so clear it was like he was standing right there in front of her. She saw his kind, wrinkled eyes, his worn-out cardigan that always smelled of sawdust and peppermint. She remembered his weathered, calloused hands guiding hers on their old, out-of-tune upright piano, the one with a sticky C-sharp key that you had to hit just right. He wasn't a maestro. He couldn't play Rachmaninoff, but he could make the piano sing. He wrote little songs for her, simple melodies with no complex chords, no thundering crescendos. They were just tunes filled with more love and truth than anything she'd ever heard in this hallowed hall. One of them, a tune he called her song, was the first piece of music she ever learned by heart. It was a conversation, a promise, a memory. It was hers. The tiny stone of defiance in her stomach began to grow. It was no longer a stone. It was an anchor, holding her in place. The urge to run was still there, a screaming voice in her head, but a quieter, stronger voice was starting to answer it. He can't judge you if he hasn't even heard you. She thought of her grandfather, who always told her, Don't just play the notes, darling. Tell the story. Even if no one else understands it, you have to tell it. She had been trying to tell someone else's story, and she had failed. But what if she told her own? Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head. Her neck felt stiff, as if she hadn't moved it in an hour. Her gaze traveled across the expanse of the stage, past the gleaming black piano, and met the maestro's cold, impatient eyes. He was expecting her to scurry away in tears. She could see it in his expression, a flicker of boredom, as if he was already waiting for the next victim. Her heart was still hammering, but it was no longer a frantic drum of fear. It was a steady, powerful beat of resolve. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was surprisingly steady, cutting through the heavy silence like a small, sharp knife. "Maestro," she said. Her voice didn't crack. It was quiet, but it was clear. The maestro raised a single, skeptical eyebrow, a gesture of mild surprise that she hadn't fled. He gestured with one hand, a sign of impatience that meant, "What is it?" "Don't waste my time," Lara swallowed, the lump in her throat finally loosening. "You are right," she said, and a few of the other students visibly flinched as if she was agreeing to her own execution. That was an amateur playing another man's music. She paused, letting the words settle. She was no longer just talking to him. She was talking to everyone, to herself. "May I play something else?" she asked, her voice gaining a little more strength with each word. "Something that is mine?" The maestro stared at her, his expression shifting from impatience to something else. It was a flicker of amusement, a cynical curiosity. He was intrigued by her audacity. This was a new development, a form of entertainment he hadn't anticipated. A corner of his mouth twitched, almost forming a smile, but it was a cold, predatory smile. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yours?" He scoffed, the word dripping with condescension. He looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive glance that took in her simple dress, her nervous posture, her entire being. "Very well," he said, his voice laced with a heavy theatrical sigh. "Let us see what an amateur considers composition. You have 1 minute. Do not waste my time." He was giving her just enough rope to hang herself, and he was looking forward to watching her do it. The other students were staring at her with a mixture of horror and fascination. They thought she was insane. They thought she was committing professional suicide right in front of them. But Alara didn't see them anymore. She didn't see the pitying faces or the gleaming hall. She saw only the piano keys, and behind them her grandfather's kind, encouraging face. She nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her head. She didn't need a minute. She had a lifetime. She turned her back to the maestro, facing the piano, as if it were an old friend. She placed her fingers on the keys, not the hesitant, trembling fingers from before, but with a new sense of purpose. This was it. This was the moment she stopped trying to be someone else and started being herself. The air in the hall was still thick with tension and doubt, but for the first time all day, Alara felt like she could breathe. Alara took a deep breath, but it wasn't the shaky, terrified breath she had taken before. This one was different. It was a breath that seemed to pull the entire room into her lungs. The dust, the light, the silence, and then let it all go. She closed her eyes, shutting out the maestro, the rows of empty seats, the trembling line of her peers. She built a wall in her mind, and on the other side of that wall was only her and the piano. She thought of the reason she had started playing, not for the stage or the applause, but for the feeling of connection it gave her. She remembered her grandfather, not as a sad memory, but as a living, breathing presence right there with her. She could almost smell the faint scent of sawdust and peppermint that always clung to his clothes, a smell that meant safety and love. She remembered his weathered hands, rough from a lifetime of work, guiding her small fingers on their old, out-of-tune upright piano. He wasn't a maestro. He couldn't read a note of music, but he could make the piano sing with feelings so real and pure it made your heart ache. This piece was for him. It was the conversation she never got to have with him after he was gone. It had no name, but it had a story, and it was time to tell it. Her fingers, which had been stiff with fear, now seemed to soften against the keys. They were no longer trying to impress or conquer. They were just touching, listening. The music that emerged was nothing like the bombastic, thundering concerto she had attempted before. It started simply, a fragile, hesitant melody, like a child asking a question they are afraid to know the answer to. The notes were sparse, falling like single drops of rain into a still pond. Each note was given its own space to breathe, to exist, before the next one arrived. It was a sound of vulnerability, of a quiet beginning. In the great hall, known for its perfect acoustics and booming sound, this small, quiet music felt impossibly intimate. The other students, who had been braced for another train wreck, found themselves leaning forward unconsciously, straining to hear. The silence between the notes was just as powerful as the notes themselves. Filled with a quiet tension that pulled everyone in, the simple melody began to shift. A new note was introduced, a note that didn't quite fit, a hint of darkness. It was like finding a crack in your favorite teacup, a small flaw that changes the way you see the whole thing. The music started to tell a story of loss. The melodies became more complex, weaving around each other in a way that sounded like a conversation where one person is no longer there to answer. There were chords that felt cold, like a draft slipping under a door, and progressions that felt like walking into an empty room and expecting to find someone, only to be met with silence. It was not technically perfect. There were raw edges, a deliberate lack of polish that felt more honest than any flawless performance. It was the sound of a memory, and memories are never perfect. They are worn at the edges, faded in places, and sometimes they hurt. A few of the students felt a prickle behind their eyes, a sudden, unexpected wave of empathy for the girl at the piano. They weren't just hearing music anymore. They were feeling her grief then, just as the sadness felt like it might become too heavy to bear. A new sound emerged from the complex tapestry of sorrow. It was a fragment of an old folk lullaby, a simple tune that felt as old as the hills. It was a tune her grandfather used to hum to her when she was sick, a tune that felt like a warm blanket on a cold night. At first, it was just a whisper of a melody, hidden within the sadder chords. But then it grew stronger, more confident. The lullaby began to push back against the grief. It was a memory of pure, uncomplicated love, a reminder that even in loss, there is beauty and warmth. The music began to build, not in volume, but in emotional weight. The two melodies, the sad one and the comforting one, began to dance together, no longer fighting, but intertwining. It was the sound of acceptance, of understanding that joy and pain can live in the same heart. The maestro, who had been slouching in his chair with a look of cynical expectation, was now leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. His face, once a mask of arrogant detachment, was now a canvas of shock and confusion. The piece began to build towards its final statement. The simple lullaby theme grew, transformed by the experience of the sad melody. It was no longer just a comforting tune. It was something more. It became a powerful, soaring crescendo of resilience and love. The notes climbed higher and higher, filled with a strength that seemed to come from a place deep within the earth. It was not a loud, aggressive sound, but a powerful, all-encompassing one. It was the sound of a spirit that had been broken and had put itself back together, stronger than before. It filled every corner of the vast hall, chasing away the shadows and the fear. It was a declaration. A declaration that love is stronger than loss, that memory is a form of immortality, and that even the smallest voice can sing the loudest song. The music reached its peak, a single, shining, powerful chord that seemed to hang in the air forever, a moment of perfect heartbreaking clarity, and then, as gently as it had begun, it started to recede. The powerful chord dissolved, and the music began to return to the simple, haunting melody of the beginning. But it was different now. The notes were the same, but they felt wiser, as if they had been on a long journey and returned home changed. The final notes were even quieter than the first ones, like an echo fading away, a last whispered word in a long conversation. When the last note faded into a profound silence, no one moved. No one breathed. The air itself seemed changed, charged with an energy that was both electric and deeply peaceful. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to have a new warmth to it. The dust motes, dancing in the beams of light, looked like tiny floating stars. The silence stretched on, heavy and sacred. It was a complete reversal from the tense, suffocating silence that had filled the hall just minutes before. This was a shared silence, a communal moment of awe. The maestro was frozen, his body leaning forward as if pulled by an invisible string. His eyes were fixed on the young woman at the piano, but he wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing through her, into the past, into a memory that was somehow his own. He wasn't hearing a composition. He was hearing a life. He was hearing a conversation between a granddaughter and the ghost of her beloved mentor. The raw, unfiltered emotion in the music was a language he had long forgotten, a truth he had buried under decades of technical perfection and intellectual superiority. He looked at his own hands, resting on his knees, hands that could play any note ever written, but had forgotten how to feel them with such purity. The rigid lines of his face seemed to soften, as if a lifetime of carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble. The other students and the few faculty members scattered in the hall were in tears, moved not by virtuosity, but by vulnerability. They had all been so focused on becoming perfect musicians that they had forgotten how to be human beings who make music. The maestro's entire worldview, his rigid hierarchy of good and bad music, was unraveling in the face of one girl's honest song. The silence that followed was a living thing. It was not the empty, waiting silence of before, nor the tense, suffocating silence that had fallen after the maestro's cruel judgment. This was a new kind of silence, a sacred space that had been created by the music. It was heavy and full, like a tapestry woven with 1,000 unspoken emotions. In the great hall, no one dared to move. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, afraid to shatter the fragile beauty that still lingered. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden beams. And for a moment, they looked like tiny, shimmering spirits, all listening. The other students stood frozen, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. Many had tears on their faces, tears they hadn't even realized were falling. They had come here to be judged, to be torn down and built back up in the image of the maestro. Instead, they had been shown something they had never expected, pure, unvarnished truth. They looked at the young woman at the piano, no longer seeing a nervous scholarship student, but a vessel for something profound. At the piano, Alara remained still, her head bowed. Her fingers rested lightly on the keys, but the energy that had flowed through them was gone. She felt utterly and completely empty, as if she had poured every drop of her soul out into the room. There was no sense of triumph, no feeling of victory. There was only a quiet, aching vulnerability. She had shared her most secret, most precious memory, and now she waited, exposed and raw, for the final judgment. She was terrified to look up, to see the expression on the maestro's face. Would he see it as just another piece of sentimental drivel? Would he find some technical flaw to pick apart, some reason to dismiss the one thing that was truly hers? The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. And with every passing moment, her fear grew colder and sharper. But the maestro did not speak. He was trapped in the silence, just like everyone else, but for a very different reason. The music had reached into the carefully constructed fortress of his mind and torn down the walls. He was no longer on his throne, judging from on high. He was a man, sitting in a chair, utterly undone. The rigid lines of his face seemed to have softened, as if a lifetime of stern discipline had been washed away by a flood of long-forgotten feeling. His eyes, which had been so cold and analytical, were now wide with a mixture of shock, pain, and a dawning, terrifying recognition. He wasn't just hearing a melody. He was hearing a conversation. He was hearing a granddaughter's love for her grandfather. A love so pure and powerful that it had transcended time and death, and was now filling his concert hall. He was transported back, against his will, to a memory he had buried for over 50 years. He saw himself not as the world-famous maestro, but as a small boy with scruffy knees, sitting on a worn wooden stool in a tiny kitchen. He saw his father, a factory worker with hands calloused and stained with grease, sitting at their old beat-up piano. His father couldn't read music, but he could play. He played simple folk tunes, songs from the old country. Songs filled with a longing and a joy that the young Victor didn't understand. He remembered his father trying to teach him one of those songs, a simple, lilting melody. But the boy, even then, was ambitious. He had no patience for the simple music. He wanted to learn the great masters, the complicated pieces. He wanted to be better than his father. He remembered scoffing at the tune, calling it noise for peasants. He saw the look of hurt on his father's face, a look he had forced himself to forget. He had dedicated his life to escaping that simple world, to mastering the complex, intellectual art of classical music. He had built a career on precision, on technical perfection, on a belief that true music was found in the complexity of the notes, not the simplicity of the heart. And now this girl. This amateur had just played him a piece of music that was everything his father's music was, and more. It had the same simple, honest soul, but it was also woven with a sophisticated understanding of harmony and emotion. It was the bridge between the two worlds he had kept so far apart. He realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that he had spent his entire life running away from the very thing that made music worth playing. He had become a gatekeeper of a soulless art form, a master of technique who had forgotten the meaning of truth. He looked at his own hands, resting on his knees, hands that could execute the most difficult passages with flawless precision. And for the first time, he saw them as sterile, lifeless tools. They were the hands of a technician, not an artist. The word he had used to condemn her, amateur, came back to him, but now it felt like a mockery. It was a testament not to her inadequacy, but to his own blindness. He was the amateur. He was the one who didn't understand. Slowly, with a great effort, he began to move. The creak of his chair as he shifted his weight was the first sound to break the sacred silence, and it caused a collective startled gasp from the students. Every eye was on him. He pushed himself up to a standing position, his movements stiff, as if he were an old man waking from a long sleep. He did not look at the audience. He did not look at the other students. His gaze was fixed on the young woman at the piano. He took a step, then another. His walk was not the confident, predatory stride of the master of the hall. It was heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man approaching a holy site. The rows of empty seats seemed to part for him as he made his way down the aisle and onto the stage. The sound of his dress shoes on the polished wood of the stage was the only sound in the world. He stopped beside the piano, a few feet away from her. A towering figure who suddenly seemed much smaller. Alara finally dared to look up. She saw him standing there, his face illuminated by the same dusty sunlight that fell on her. She saw the raw emotion in his eyes, an emotion she couldn't quite name. But it wasn't anger or contempt. It was something else, something deeper. She braced herself for the final blow, the one that would shatter her completely. He opened his mouth to speak, and his voice was not the sharp, cutting instrument they all knew. It was thick, rough, with an emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "What you just played," he began, his gaze unwavering, "was not music." A fresh wave of fear washed over Alara, but he continued before she could process it. "It was truth." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. "And I have spent so many years chasing music that I forgot how to find the truth." He turned slightly, addressing the stunned students and faculty in the hall. "We are taught to revere the masters, to perfect the notes, to win the competitions. We are taught that technique is the highest virtue. But this young woman has just reminded me that the truest art comes not from skill, but from a place that skill cannot touch. It comes from honesty. It comes from love." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and he had to stop and clear his throat. The great maestro, the unshakable pillar of the conservatory, was visibly shaken. He turned back to Alara, his expression now one of profound, humbling respect. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely it was dizzying. He was no longer the judge, and she was no longer the defendant. They were just two people, standing before a piano. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple, direct, and more powerful than any critique he had ever given. "You are not an amateur. You are a storyteller. And I have nothing to teach you about that." He took another step closer, closing the distance between them. He looked at her, not as a student to be molded, but as an equal, as a guide. But, he added, a flicker of his old passionate self returning to his eyes, a passion no longer tainted by arrogance, if you will let me. I would like to help you learn how to write that story down so that the world can understand it. Not as your master, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but as your first student. The words hung in the air, fragile and impossibly heavy. Not as your master, but as your first student. The silence that followed was not the sacred, reverent silence from moments before. This was a new silence, a stunned, breathless void where the old world had just ended and a new one had not yet begun. Ilara stared up at the maestro, her mind struggling to process the seismic shift. The man who had held the power to crush her with a single word was now standing before her, offering himself to her guidance. The shame and humiliation that had been burning her from the inside out were extinguished, replaced by a profound, bewildering sense of responsibility. She felt no triumph, no surge of ego. She felt only the immense weight of what he was asking, a weight that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. She saw the raw honesty in his eyes, the vulnerability of a man who had just torn down his own fortress and was standing in the rubble. She saw not the maestro, but a man who had lost his way and was asking for directions. Slowly, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all she could manage. It was an acceptance, not of a student, but of a shared humanity. A collective, audible breath was released from the students and faculty watching. It was the sound of a spell being broken. The maestro held her gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of something like gratitude in his eyes, before he turned to face the rest of the hall. He was no longer the imposing figure on the throne. He was just a man standing on a stage, looking out at a sea of shocked faces. "For 50 years, he began, his voice regaining a fraction of its old strength. But now it was tempered with a new warmth, a humility that was disarming. "For 50 years I have stood in this hall and taught you that perfection was the goal. That technique was the God you must worship. I have taught you to fear mistakes, to shun vulnerability, to polish your music until it was so clean and so perfect that it had no soul left. I was wrong." He paused, letting the confession sink in. "I have been teaching you to be perfect technicians. I have been teaching you to be beautiful, intricate clocks. But music is not a clock. It is a heartbeat, and I apologize." The apology was not directed at any one person, but at all of them. At every student he had ever made to feel small. Every spark of creativity he had ever snuffed out in the name of perfection. A few of the older faculty members looked as if they might faint. The students were utterly transfixed. "Your assignment for this week is canceled," he announced, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "Instead, your assignment is this. Go find your story. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be about loss or grief. It can be about the first time you saw the ocean, or the taste of your grandmother's bread, or the feeling of riding a bicycle down a steep hill. Find something real. Find something that is yours. And don't come back here until you can sit at that piano and tell it to me. Not with perfect notes, but with truth. Class is dismissed." He turned and walked away from the podium, not back to his throne, but towards the side of the stage. The students didn't move at first, as if they were waiting for the punchline. But then a young woman near the front began to pack up her bag, a slow, thoughtful smile on her face. Then another. Soon, the hall was filled with the quiet sounds of people gathering their things, but the atmosphere was completely different. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, buzzing sense of possibility. They were no longer just students trying to please a master. They were storytellers with a story to find. The great hall slowly emptied, the sunlight growing softer and more golden as the afternoon began to wane. Soon, only Ilara and the maestro were left. He approached her again, his steps now slower, more measured. He did not stand over her, but pulled up another simple bench and sat beside her, a respectful distance away. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, two people in a vast, quiet hall, looking at the piano keys as if they held the secrets of the universe. "Tell me about him," the maestro said finally, his voice soft. "Your grandfather. He wasn't asking about the music. He was asking about the man behind the music." And so she did. She told him about the old out-of-tune piano, about the sticky C-sharp key. She told him about her grandfather's hands, rough and kind, and the way he hummed old folk tunes while he worked. She told him about the little song he wrote for her, the one that had become the heart of her piece. As she spoke, the maestro listened. He didn't interrupt, he didn't critique. He just listened, his eyes focused on her face, absorbing every detail. He was a student, and this was his first, most important lesson. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I had a father who played like that," he said, his voice distant. "Simple tunes. I was ashamed of them. I wanted to play the great masters. I thought his music was common." He looked down at his own hands, the hands of a virtuoso. "I haven't thought about those tunes in 50 years. You have given me back a piece of my own story." He stood up. "We need to write this down. Your story? Before it fades. We need to give it a voice that will last." He walked off the stage and returned a moment later with a stack of fresh staff paper and a pencil. He placed them on the music stand in front of her. It was a simple act, but it was profound. The great maestro was fetching paper for the amateur. "Play it for me again," he said. "Slowly, one phrase at a time, and I will try to keep up." And so they began. She would play a few bars of the simple, haunting melody, and he would scribble furiously on the staff paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't just transcribing notes. He was asking questions. Is this chord a question or a statement? He would ask, is this pause a moment of peace or a moment of doubt? He was helping her translate the raw emotion of her memory into the universal language of music. He was not changing her music. He was giving it the tools it needed to speak clearly. The sun continued to sink, casting long shadows across the stage, but they didn't notice. They were lost in their work, a master and a student, a teacher and a guide, two storytellers weaving a single tale. The old hierarchy was gone, replaced by something far more powerful, a partnership. And in the quiet of the empty hall, a new song was being born. A song that was not just about a girl and her grandfather, but also about a proud man who finally remembered how to listen.